The war map flickered red. Every corner of it, every system, every station, red. Admiral Sorith Vel stood before the massive holographic display with all four of his insectoid arms folded behind his back and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Behind him, the command deck of Citadel Yuvon hummed with quiet panic. Officers moved between stations with hurried steps, their voices low and tight. Reports poured in from a dozen dying frontlines. Colony worlds swallowed whole, fleets torn apart like wet paper, billions of lives winking out of existence, one system at a time. The Vrethkai Dominion was winning, not slowly, not carefully. They were winning the way a fire wins against dry grass completely and without effort. Sorith had been a soldier for 40 years. He had fought border wars, pirate fleets, and rogue warlords. He had never lost a campaign. But this was not a campaign. This was extinction dressed in the skin of war. The Vrethkai were not like any enemy the Coalition had ever faced. They were a hive mind, billions of organisms sharing one intelligence, one will, one hunger. Their ships were not built. They were grown. Living things the size of cities, with hulls of bone and weapons of acid and plasma that fired from mouths that screamed as they killed. They adapted to every weapon, every tactic, every trick. What worked once never worked again. Operation Burning Veil had been the Coalition's greatest effort. 30,000 warships from 40 species, united under a single battle plan. The largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. It was supposed to break the Vrethkai advance at the Soreth Nebula. It lasted 11 hours. Sorith closed his eyes and saw the final transmission again. Ships cracking open, crews screaming, bioships wrapping around cruisers like snakes around prey, dissolving the metal with acid that ate through everything. 30,000 ships, gone, and the Vrethkai had not even slowed down. A chime sounded. The High Conclave was assembling. Sorith turned from the war map and walked through the long silver corridor toward the council chamber. His steps echoed. The station felt emptier every day. Non-essential personnel had been evacuated weeks ago. Those who remained did so because they had nowhere else to go. The council chamber was a wide, circular room with seats rising in tiers around a central platform. Representatives from dozens of species filled those seats, tall, short, scaled, furred, feathered, crystalline. The Coalition was the most diverse alliance the galaxy had ever known, and right now it was the most frightened. Sorith took his place at the central platform and activated the war map again. Red filled the room like a wound. "You have all seen the reports," he said. His voice was calm. It had to be. Operation Burning Veil has failed. The Vrethkai advance continues across all sectors. At current speed, they will reach the inner systems within 90 days. Silence, then noise, too much noise. Delegates shouted over each other. The Pelori ambassador demanded immediate surrender. The Gorvathi general slammed a fist on his console and called the Pelori a coward. The Silphery delegate wept softly. 3 species began arguing about whose fleet had retreated first. Sorith let them shout. He understood. Fear made people loud. When the noise died, a voice rose from the back of the chamber. It was thin and old, but it carried. "There is one option you have not considered." Every head turned. Elder Morvan stood slowly from his seat. He was Draelith, small, gray-skinned amphibian with large, wet eyes that had seen more centuries than most species had records. He was the Coalition's oldest living historian. Most delegates respected him. Some thought he was half mad. "Elder Morvan," Sorith said carefully, "speak." Morvan descended the steps to the central platform. His movements were slow but steady. He looked around the room at the faces of 40 species and took a breath. "There is a world," he said, "that appears on no star chart. A world that was erased from every record, every archive, every memory we could reach. A world the ancestors of our ancestors sealed shut and swore never to open." He paused. "It is called Throne." The room went cold. Not silent, cold. Sarith could feel the temperature of the conversation change. "That is a myth," the Pelori ambassador said quickly. "A ghost story." "It is not a myth," Morvan said. "I have spent my life studying the gaps in our history, the places where records were deliberately destroyed, and I found fragments, enough to know the truth." He looked at Sarith. "Before any of our species reached the stars, there was another, an older species. They rose before us. They built empires before we built cities, and they waged wars that burned holes in space itself." "Why have we never heard of them?" Sarith asked. "Because our ancestors erased them," Morvan said simply. "Every record, every name, every image. They cooperated. Species that had never agreed on anything worked together for the first and only time in history to make sure this species was forgotten." "Why?" Morvan's wet eyes glistened. "Because they were afraid, not of what this species had done, but of what they could do. These beings did not fight like us. They did not wage war from necessity or instinct. They studied war. They perfected it. They turned destruction into a science and then into an art. They were so dangerous that when they finally went quiet, the entire galaxy breathed easier and prayed they would never wake." The chamber was absolutely still. "And they are on this world?" Sarith asked. "Throne." "Sleeping," Morvan said. "Billions of them, sealed inside a hollow planet in dead space in tombs of ice and silence, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "To be needed." Sarith stared at the old historian for a long time. Around them, delegates shifted in their seats. He could feel their fear, not just of the Vrethkai anymore, but of something older and deeper. "If we wake them," Sarith said slowly, "what happens?" Morvan did not blink. "I do not know. We may save the galaxy, or we may trade one apocalypse for another. The records do not say what they will do when they open their eyes. They only say what they were capable of when they closed them." Sarith looked back at the war map. Red everywhere. 90 days until the inner systems fell. 90 days until everything ended. He thought about the 30,000 ships lost at Sarath. He thought about the colony worlds already consumed, the billions of people already gone, digested inside living ships, their screams unheard in the vacuum. He thought about what was coming if nothing changed. Then he made his decision. "Prepare a ship," he told his aide. "Small, fast, and unmarked. I am going to throne." The chamber erupted, but Sarith was already walking out. Morvan followed, his old legs moving faster than they had in decades. Behind them, the war map pulsed red, and the galaxy continued to die. 3 hours later, a small stealth vessel called the Quiet Passage slipped away from Citadel Yuvan and jumped into darkness, carrying 4 souls toward a world that was never supposed to be found. The Quiet Passage dropped out of hyperspace into nothing. No stars, no stations, no signal traffic, just empty black in every direction as if they had flown off the edge of the universe. The navigation system flickered and struggled, unable to lock onto any known reference point. They were in dead space, a region so far from any mapped system that light itself seemed tired here. Sarith stood at the forward viewport and stared into the darkness. Beside him, Elder Morvan consulted a device that looked older than most civilizations, a hand-carved data crystal containing the coordinates he had spent his life piecing together. "There," Morvan said, pointing at what appeared to be empty space. The pilot adjusted course. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then the sensors picked up something massive directly ahead, something the size of a planet that was somehow invisible to every standard scan. "It is shielded," Morvan whispered. "Of course it is." As they drew closer, the shields flickered, and the planet appeared as if stepping out from behind a curtain. It was enormous and gray, its surface perfectly smooth in some places and scarred with strange geometric patterns in others. It looked less like a natural world and more like something that had been manufactured. Captain Dren Hask leaned forward in his seat. He was Gorvathi, broad, heavily muscled, with 4 arms and skin like cracked stone. He had fought in more battles than he could count and feared very little. But looking at this planet, something cold moved through his chest. "The surface," he said. "What is written on it?" The ship's cameras zoomed in. The geometric patterns were not natural formations. They were words. Thousands of lines of text carved into the planet's crust in hundreds of different languages and scripts. As the ship's translation systems worked, the same message appeared again and again in every tongue. "Do not open, do not wake, do not remember." The fourth member of their crew made a small, broken sound. Lyriel was silvery, slender, pale-skinned, with wide silver eyes. She was a bioempath, born with the ability to sense the emotions of living beings around her. She had pressed herself against the far wall of the cockpit, her hands gripping the metal behind her. "Lyriel," Sareth said. "They are alive," she breathed. "Inside, I can feel them, not one or two, not thousands." Her voice cracked. "Billions, all of them dreaming." "What are they dreaming about?" Lyriel's silver eyes were wet. "Everything, all at once. Joy and grief and rage and love and hunger and music and war and tenderness. All of it tangled together, all of it burning. I have never felt anything like this. Every species I have ever read has one emotional color at a time. These beings are every color at once. It is like staring into a sun." Sareth exchanged a look with Dren. The soldier's jaw was tight. They found an opening on the planet's surface. A massive circular hatch sealed with mechanisms that had not moved in millennia. Morvan guided them to an access point, and after several tense minutes of working with systems none of them recognized, the hatch groaned open. The quiet passage descended into throne. What they found inside stole the words from all of them. The planet was hollow, just as Morvan had said, but that simple description did not prepare them for the reality. The interior was a world unto itself, a vast, curved landscape stretching in every direction, lit by strips of bioluminescent material that ran along the ceiling like artificial veins. Cities rose along the inner walls, built vertically, towers hanging at impossible angles held in place by gravity generators that still hummed after all this time. Forests had grown wild in the dark, thick and strange, their roots gripping metal floors. Rivers of glowing water wound between structures that were half nature and half machine. And everywhere in the cities, in the forests, in chambers carved deep into the walls, there were cryovaults. Millions of them, row after row after row, stacked and organized with a precision that spoke of a species that planned everything down to the last detail. Each vault held a single body, frozen in dreamless cold, waiting. "How many?" Dren asked quietly. "The fragments said billions," Morvan answered. "I see no reason to doubt that now." They flew deeper, following a signal that pulsed from the planet's core. The cities grew older the deeper they went. The architecture changed, became grander, heavier, more deliberate. Whatever species had built this place, they had built it to last forever. At the very center of Throne, they found the Heartspire. It was a tower of black metal and light, rising from the planet's core like a spine. It pulsed with energy, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. As the quiet passage landed on a platform at its base, the tower reacted. Lights raced up its surface. A deep sound vibrated through the hull, felt more than heard. They stepped out of the ship. The air was cold and clean and old. A voice spoke. It came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. It spoke in every known language simultaneously, a chorus of tongues layered on top of each other, before it settled on Coalition standard. "You have come to the sealed world," the voice said. It was calm and deep and carried a weight of patience that made Morvan's ancient years feel like a blink. "I am the Heartspire. I am the keeper of the sleeping. I was built to wait, and I have waited. State your purpose." Sareth stepped forward. His throat was dry. "We are the Galactic Coalition. We are at war with an enemy we cannot defeat. Our worlds are falling. Our people are dying. We have come because we have no other choice." The Heartspire was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, its voice was softer. I know why species come to doors they were told never to open. I have been listening to the galaxy's signals for a very long time. I know about your Vrethkai. I know about your war. I know about your dead. Then you know why we are here, Soreth said. I do, but before I grant what you ask, you must understand what you are asking for. The beings who sleep inside this world are called humans. They were the first to reach the stars in this region of space. They built civilizations that spanned galaxies. They created music that made nebulae weep and weapons that cracked moons in half. They loved deeply and fought savagely, and never, not once in their entire history, stopped reaching for more. The Heartspire paused. They sealed themselves here because they understood what they were. They could not stop competing, could not stop adapting, could not stop winning. Every species they encountered was eventually overshadowed, not through malice, but through sheer, relentless capability. They chose to sleep so that the galaxy could grow without living in their shadow. Soreth felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. I ask you one question, the Heartspire said, and I ask it not as a test but as a record, so that when the sleepers wake and ask me why, I can give them your answer. The lights along the tower pulsed once slowly. Is it bad enough to justify what we are? Soreth thought of the war map, all that red, the 30,000 ships at Sarath, the colony worlds consumed, the children who would never grow up, the futures that had already been swallowed. Yes, he said, it is. The Heartspire hummed. The vibration traveled through the floor, through the walls, through the planet itself. Deep below, something ancient began to stir. Then the waking protocol begins. Somewhere in the dark, a cryovault hissed, then another, then 100, 1,000. The sound built like rain on a metal roof, growing and growing. A vault near the base of the Heartspire slid open. Cold mist poured out. A hand emerged, 5 fingers, pale skin, strong grip. A woman sat up slowly, frost falling from her hair and shoulders. She blinked in the dim light with dark brown eyes that were sharp even before they were fully open. She looked at Soreth. She looked at Dren. She looked at Morvan and Lyriel. She studied them the way a predator studies its surroundings, not with hostility, but with total, absolute awareness. Then she spoke, her voice rough from centuries of silence. How long were we asleep? Morvan answered, his voice barely a whisper. By our best estimate, 8,000 years. The woman absorbed this. Her expression did not change. She simply nodded, as if 8,000 years were a delay she had expected. My name is Cassandra Morrigan, she said. I was the last to sleep. Tell me what has gone wrong. Around her, vault after vault continued to open, and the sound of billions beginning to breathe again filled the hollow world like a tide coming in. The Heartspire did not wake everyone at once. It followed a sequence that had been programmed 8,000 years ago, designed for exactly this moment, the moment someone came knocking. First came the General's Circle, 12 military leaders, each one chosen before the long sleep as the sharpest minds humanity had. They woke within hours of each other, rising from their vaults with the same calm efficiency, shaking off millennia of ice as though they had simply taken a long nap. Cassandra Morrigan gathered them in a chamber near the Heartspire's base. Soreth and his crew were invited to attend, and what they witnessed in that room unsettled them in ways the Vrethkai never had. Soreth had expected coldness. He had expected the calculating silence of master strategists, the grim focus of ancient warriors preparing for a task. What he got instead was laughter. The 12 generals embraced each other. They joked. One man, tall, dark-skinned, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, picked up a smaller woman and spun her around while she cursed at him in a language the translators could not parse. Another sat quietly in the corner, weeping, and no one treated this as weakness. A fourth was already doing physical exercises on the floor, stretching muscles that had been frozen for 80 centuries. Lyriel pressed her back against the wall. The emotional output in the room was staggering. She could feel every one of them, their joy at seeing each other, their grief for the time lost, their quiet fear of what waited outside, their iron determination beneath it all. It was not a single feeling. It was a storm of feelings, all existing at the same time, none canceling the others out. "How do they function?" she whispered to Morvan. "They are feeling everything simultaneously. Any Sylphery experiencing this would shut down. How do they think clearly?" Morvan shook his head. "I do not believe they think clearly despite the emotions. I believe they think clearly because of them." Cassandra called the room to order. The laughter stopped. The tears dried. The exercises paused. In the span of a single breath, 12 people who had been laughing and crying shifted into something else entirely, something focused and sharp and utterly professional. The transition was so fast it made Dren Hask's scales prickle. "Admiral," Cassandra said, turning to Soreth, "tell us everything." Soreth gave them the full briefing. The Vrethkai, their biology, their hive mind structure, their fleet size, their methods of consumption. The Coalition's failed strategies. The 30,000 ships lost at Sorath. The projected timeline for total collapse. The humans listened without interrupting. Some took notes on devices the Heartspire provided. Others simply stared at the holographic displays with expressions that Soreth could not read. When he finished, the room was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then they began to talk. Soreth had attended war councils on dozens of worlds. He had watched the finest military minds of 40 species debate and plan. None of it compared to what happened in that room over the next 16 hours. The humans argued. They shouted. They drew diagrams in the air with their hands and erased them and drew new ones. They challenged each other's assumptions with a ferocity that looked like anger but was not. They built ideas on top of each other's ideas, tearing down the weak parts and reinforcing the strong ones, moving so fast that Soreth's translator struggled to keep pace. Dren Hask watched with the eyes of a professional soldier, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. The Gorvathi were considered the Coalition's finest warriors. They fought with strength, discipline, and honor. But the humans did not approach war as a test of strength or honor. They approached it as a problem to be solved, and they were willing to consider any solution, no matter how ruthless, no matter how unconventional, no matter how morally uncomfortable. One general proposed targeting the Vrethkai's food supply, starving them by poisoning entire planetary ecosystems ahead of their advance. Another suggested using the Vrethkai's own adaptation against them, by feeding them false patterns to learn, then exploiting the false lessons. A third outlined a method for turning captured bioships into weapons against the hive mind, essentially forcing the Vrethkai to fight themselves. Nothing was off the table. Nothing was dismissed as too cruel or too extreme without first being examined for effectiveness. And yet, and this was what confused Dren most, they were not cruel people. Between tactical discussions, they asked about the Coalition civilians. They wanted to know how many refugees needed protection. They asked about medical infrastructure, food supplies, and evacuation routes. They cared. They genuinely, unmistakably cared. "They are a contradiction," Dren told Soreth during a brief pause. "They plan atrocities with the same breath they use to ask about children." "Not a contradiction," Lyriel said softly. She had been listening from across the room, still overwhelmed but no longer retreating. "They care about the children. That is why they are willing to plan atrocities. The compassion and the ruthlessness come from the same place." When the 16 hours ended, Cassandra stood before the room and presented the completed plan. She called it Operation Apotheosis. It was, without question, the most aggressive and complex battle strategy Soreth had ever seen. It involved deception on a fleet-wide scale, weapons the Coalition had never imagined, psychological attacks on the hive mind's information processing, and a level of coordination that would have been impossible for any species that could not adapt in real time. It required waking 500 million humans. It required converting Throne itself, the entire hollow planet, into a mobile war platform, and it required the Coalition to trust a species they had erased from history. "Your enemy adapts to every threat," Cassandra told Soreth, her gray eyes steady. "That is impressive, but adaptation is what humans were born to do. The difference between us and the Vrethkai is simple. They adapt to survive. We adapt to win. And we do not stop adapting until the fight is over." Soreth studied her face. "You sound confident." "I am not confident," Cassandra said. "I am certain. These are different things. Confidence is hope wearing armor. Certainty is knowing what you are capable of and choosing to use it." She paused. "We did not seal ourselves inside a planet because we were weak, Admiral. We did it because we knew exactly how strong we were and it terrified us. You have asked us to stop being terrified, so we will." Over the following days, the waking accelerated. 500 million humans rose from their vaults and immediately began to work. The speed of it stunned the Coalition crew. There was no confusion, no disorientation, no period of adjustment. The Heartspire had kept their minds active during the long sleep, running simulations and training programs in their dreams. They woke up sharp. Engineers swarmed Throne's ancient engines, massive drives buried in the planet's crust that had not fired in 8,000 years. They repaired, modified, and improved them in days. Soldiers assembled in units with practiced precision, checking weapons that looked primitive and brutal compared to Coalition technology, but radiated an energy that made Dren's instruments spike. Soreth walked through the waking city and felt like an insect inside a machine. Everywhere he looked, humans were building, planning, moving. They sang while they worked, actual songs, with melodies and harmonies, as though music were as essential to them as air. A group of engineers sang in rhythm while assembling a weapons array. Soldiers hummed together while cleaning equipment. Children, woken alongside their parents, played games among the cryovaults, laughing and chasing each other through the ancient corridors. Lyria walked beside him, no longer shaking but deeply quiet. "What do you feel?" Soreth asked her. "Everything," she said. "They radiate so much life that it almost hurts. Every other species I have ever sensed is like a single instrument playing one note. These beings are an entire orchestra, and every instrument is playing at full volume all the time." She looked at Soreth. "I understand now why the galaxy was afraid of them, and I understand why they were afraid of themselves." On the 7th day, the engines of Throne fired for the first time in 8 millennia. The hollow planet shuddered. Dust fell from ceilings that had not moved since before the Coalition existed. The bioluminescent rivers rippled. Deep below, something vast and powerful roared to life. Throne began to move. The planet, the sealed, forbidden, erased world, turned its ancient face toward the stars and started its journey toward the war. Inside the command chamber, Cassandra Morgan stood before a holographic map of the galaxy and placed her hand on the Vareth corridor. The path the Vrethkai Armada was using to consume everything in its way. "Here," she said, "we meet them here." And 500 million humans, awake and ready, carried inside a world that was now a weapon, agreed. The Vrethkai Armada moved through the Vareth corridor like a living river of teeth and hunger. Tens of thousands of bioships, each one a breathing organism the size of a city, with hulls of hardened bone and weapons that grew from their flesh like thorns. At their center floated the Overmind, the command organism, a moon-sized creature that pulsed with the intelligence of the entire hive. It thought for all of them. It adapted for all of them. It had never failed. Ahead of the Armada, a Coalition colony world called Verith Prime was being evacuated. Transport ships fled in desperate waves, carrying millions of civilians away from the approaching swarm. They would not all make it. The Vrethkai were too fast. And then Throne arrived. The Vrethkai's sensors detected it, a massive object dropping out of hyperspace at the far end of the corridor. The hive mind analyzed it and classified it as a rogue planetoid dead rock tumbling through space. It was large but posed no threat. The armada adjusted course slightly to avoid it and continued forward. That was the last mistake the Vrethkai hive mind ever made. Throne split open. The planet cracked along fault lines that had been engineered 8,000 years ago, massive sections of its shell folding outward like the petals of an iron flower. Light poured from inside, the glow of engines and weapons, and a civilization that had just woken up angry. From within Throne's hollow core, thousands of warships launched. They were unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. No smooth curves, no elegant designs. These were angular, heavy, brutal machines covered in weapons that bristled from every surface. They were ugly and efficient and built for exactly one purpose. The first volley fired across the Vareth corridor, and for a brief moment, the stars themselves seemed to flinch. Plasma bolts the size of buildings slammed into the leading edge of the Vrethkai formation. Bioships shattered. Bone hulls cracked and spilled burning fluid into the vacuum. The hive mind reacted instantly. It pulled its fleet into a defensive formation it had used successfully against coalition forces dozens of times, clustering its ships together to share shield organisms and concentrate firepower. Cassandra Morrigan, watching from Throne's command center, smiled. "They adapted," she said. "Good. That is exactly the formation we needed them in." The first wave of human ships had attacked in a pattern deliberately designed to mimic the coalition's failed strategies. Scattered charges, predictable formations, obvious targeting priorities. The hive mind had seen these tactics before and knew exactly how to counter them. It pulled its fleet tight, creating a dense wall of bioships that would be nearly impossible to break through with conventional attacks. Which was the point, because conventional attacks were only the first step. Across the corridor, hidden in the debris fields and asteroid clusters where they had been deployed hours before the main fleet arrived, 200 human stealth ships powered up simultaneously. They were small, fast, and carried no conventional weapons. Instead, each one held a gravity well generator, a device that created a localized artificial singularity, a point of gravity so intense that nothing within its range could move. 200 gravity wells activated behind and around the Vrethkai formation. The bioships, packed tightly together in their defensive cluster, suddenly found themselves trapped. They could not scatter. They could not retreat. They could not maneuver. The hive mind screamed across its network ordering adaptation, but there was nothing to adapt to. Gravity was not a tactic. It was physics. And then the humans changed tactics again. Every 90 seconds the human fleet shifted its approach. New weapons, new angles, new formations. They never repeated a pattern. They never gave the hive mind a stable dataset to analyze. The Vrethkai's greatest strength, their ability to adapt to any threat, became useless because by the time they adapted to one approach, it was already gone, replaced by something entirely different. Dren Hask stood on the bridge of a coalition observation vessel, watching the battle unfold on tactical displays, and felt something he had never felt before in a lifetime of warfare. He felt outclassed, not by the Vrethkai, by the humans. The Gorvathi fought with discipline. They followed battle plans. They held formations. But the humans fought like water flowing around obstacles, filling gaps, changing shape instantly. Individual captains made decisions without waiting for orders. Squads adapted on the fly. There was no rigid hierarchy in the fight itself, only a shared understanding of the goal and absolute trust that every person would find their own way to achieve it. "They are not following the battle plan," Dren said. "They are," Soreth replied from beside him. His voice was quiet with awe. "The plan was designed to be adapted in real time. Cassandra told them the objective and trusted them to find the path." Then the Heartspire fired. Throne's core, the great tower of black metal and light, revealed what it truly was. Not merely a gatekeeper, not merely an artificial intelligence. It was a directed psionic weapon, built to target networked consciousness. It charged for 11 seconds, the energy building until the entire planet hummed with it, and then it released a pulse that crossed the battlefield at the speed of thought. The effect on the Vrethkai was immediate and devastating. The hive mind shattered, not destroyed, fragmented. Billions of organisms that had shared one intelligence for their entire existence suddenly found themselves alone in their own heads for the first time. Bioships that had moved in perfect coordination began to drift, to spin, to collide with each other. Some panicked and fired blindly. Others simply stopped, paralyzed by the sudden silence where the hive's voice had been. The Vrethkai armada dissolved into chaos. Cassandra's voice came across every human channel, calm and clear. Phase 4, take the Overmind. Human troop transports surged forward, carrying ground forces toward the Vrethkai command organism. The Overmind was still partially functional. Its own psionic defenses had shielded it from the worst of the Heartspire's pulse. But it was wounded and confused, its control over the fleet broken. The boarding action was savage. Human soldiers breached the Overmind's bone hull with cutting tools and explosives, then poured into its living interior. The inside of a Vrethkai command organism was a nightmare, walls of wet flesh, corridors that pulsed and contracted, defensive organisms that attacked anything foreign. The air was toxic. The gravity shifted without warning. Every surface was a weapon. The humans did not care. They moved in squads, adapting their tactics room by room, corridor by corridor. When their weapons failed against the Overmind's internal defenses, they improvised new ones from the organism's own biology. When corridors collapsed, they cut new paths. When defensive organisms attacked, they learned the creature's patterns in seconds and exploited their blind spots. Dren Hask was among them. He had demanded to join the boarding party and Cassandra had allowed it. He fought beside human soldiers and for the first time in his life struggled to keep pace with allies rather than enemies. They were not stronger than him. They were not faster, but they were relentless in a way that transcended physical ability. They simply refused to stop. A human sergeant named Tors took a wound that would have put any Gorvathi on the ground, a deep slash across her ribs from a defensive tendril. She pressed her hand against the wound, cursed once in a language Dren did not know, and kept fighting. When Dren tried to pull her back, she looked at him with eyes that were bright with pain and fury and something else, something almost joyful. "We are almost there," she said. "I am not stopping now." They reached the Overmind's core, a pulsing chamber of neural tissue that served as the hive mind's central brain. Tors planted the charges while Dren held the corridor. The explosion, when it came, was not loud. It was a shudder, a sigh, a vast living thing finally going quiet. The Overmind died, and with it, the last thread holding the Vrethkai armada together. Outside, in the black between the stars, the remaining bioships fled. They scattered in every direction, blind and alone, running from a fight they could no longer understand. The battle was over. But the moment that would be remembered longest happened in the final minutes of the fighting, before the Overmind fell. A damaged Vrethkai bioship, spinning out of control with its navigation destroyed, tumbled directly toward a coalition refugee transport. The transport carried 200,000 civilians, families, children, elderly, who had fled Verith Prime. It had no weapons. It could not move fast enough to escape. 3 human cruisers broke formation. No one ordered them to. No signal was sent. Their captains simply saw the transport, saw the threat, and turned their ships into the path of the bioship. All 3 cruisers hit the bioship simultaneously, their reactors overloading on impact. The explosion consumed the bioship entirely. It also consumed all 3 cruisers and every soul on board. The transport survived untouched. Sareth watched the explosions fade on his display. He stared at the empty space where 3 ships had been moments before. "The battle was already won," he said softly. "Why did they do that?" Cassandra stood beside him. She had watched it too. Her expression was still, but her eyes were bright. "Because there were people on that transport," she said. "That is reason enough. It always has been. The Vareth corridor fell silent. Wreckage drifted in the dark, bone and metal and frozen vapor. The stars, which had flickered during the bombardment, burned steady once more. On every coalition ship in the fleet, alien crews stood at their viewports and stared at the human vessels regrouping among the ruins. What they felt was not fear. It was something far more complicated and far more lasting. It was awe. The weeks that followed were quieter than anyone expected. Without the Overmind, the Vrethkai Dominion came apart. The hive mind that had held billions of organisms together as one intelligence was gone, and what remained were fragments, small clusters of bioships that wandered aimlessly through space, confused and leaderless. Some still attacked when provoked, but they were no longer coordinated, no longer adapting, no longer the unstoppable force that had nearly consumed the galaxy. They were animals without a shepherd, dangerous but directionless. Coalition forces, supported by human patrols, spent the weeks clearing the remaining clusters system by system. It was grim, necessary work, but it was work with an ending in sight. For the first time in a generation, the galaxy could see a future that did not involve extinction. The real battle, however, had only just begun. It happened not on a battlefield, but inside the council chamber of Citadel Yuvon, where the High Conclave gathered to answer a question that was far harder than how to win a war. What do you do with the humans? The chamber was full. Every species had sent representatives, and every representative had an opinion. The debate had been building for days in corridors, in private meetings, in messages sent across secure channels. By the time the conclave formally convened, the room was already divided. The Pelori ambassador spoke first. He had pushed for surrender before, now he pushed for containment. They served their purpose, he said, his thin voice carrying across the chamber. We owe them gratitude. But gratitude does not erase the reason they were sealed away in the first place. They are too powerful, too unpredictable, too human. We should thank them, compensate them generously, and ask them to return to their sleep. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the chamber. Fear was still fresh. The coalition had seen what humans could do at the Vareth corridor, and some of them had not slept well since. The Gorvathi general stood next. Cowardice, he said bluntly. We begged them to fight for us. They bled for us. 3 ships gave themselves so that our civilians could live, and now you want to lock them back in a tomb. You dishonor every soldier who has ever fought beside an ally. More murmurs, louder this time. The room swayed back and forth. Others spoke. The Silphery delegation called for a period of cultural exchange, arguing that understanding humans was more important than fearing them. A coalition of smaller species demanded restrictions, limits on human fleet size, human territory, human expansion. A Dralith philosopher suggested that perhaps the galaxy should ask the humans what they wanted instead of deciding for them. The debate went on for hours. It grew heated. Old fears clashed with new respect. The memory of the Vrethkai's horrors competed with the memory of human warships tearing through space. Species that had been saved by human sacrifice argued with species that had watched the battle from a distance and seen only the terrifying efficiency of it. Finally, Soreth stood. The chamber quieted. He had earned something in the past weeks, not just respect but trust. He was the one who had gone to throne. He was the one who had made the decision. And he was the one who had stood on the bridge and watched both the destruction and the sacrifice. I sealed them away in my mind before I ever reached their world, he said. I expected monsters. I expected cold, ancient killers who would fight our war and then turn on us. That is what the old records suggested. That is what our fear told us. He paused. I was wrong. He looked around the chamber. I watched them wake up and embrace each other. I watched them sing while they repaired engines that had not run in 8,000 years. I watched a soldier named Tors take a wound that would have killed most of us and keep fighting, not because she was mindless or savage, but because she knew there were people depending on her. His voice was steady. We sealed them away because we feared what they could do, and then when our worlds were burning, we begged them to do exactly that. We cannot praise their swords with one breath and curse the hands that hold them with the next. That is not justice. That is cowardice. The chamber was still. They are awake, Soreth said. They fought for us. They died for us. They deserve a place among us. The vote that followed was not unanimous. It never would be, not with something this large. But it passed. By a margin wider than anyone had predicted, the Galactic Coalition voted to offer humanity a seat, not as subjects, not as weapons, but as members. What the Conclave did not know was that the choice had already been made for them. That evening, Cassandra met with Soreth privately in a small room overlooking the stars. She looked tired for the first time since he had known her. Not physically tired, something deeper. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a truth you cannot set down. There is something you need to know, she said. The Heartspire's psionic weapon was not designed to be fired at full power. It was a defensive system, a last resort. When we used it against the Vrethkai hive mind, it damaged itself. The core systems are failing. Throne's cryovaults are no longer functional. Soreth understood immediately. You cannot go back to sleep. No, Cassandra said. Even if the Conclave had voted to seal us away again, it would not have mattered. The vaults are dead. The Heartspire is dying. We are awake now, Admiral, permanently. She stood by the viewport, the light of distant stars on her face. My people chose to sleep because we were afraid of what we were. We thought removing ourselves was the noble thing to do. Maybe it was, but you cannot undo a waking. We are here now, and the galaxy is going to have to learn to live with us. A faint smile crossed her face. And we are going to have to learn to live with ourselves. Soreth watched her for a moment. Are you afraid? Always, Cassandra said. That is the human condition. We are always afraid, we just never let it stop us. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to change. Morvan returned to his archives and began the work he had spent his life preparing for. He wrote a new history, one that did not erase humanity. He pulled together every fragment he had found, every hidden record, every suppressed account, and combined them with first-hand testimony from humans who remembered the time before the sleep. The document he produced was not flattering. It was honest. It included humanity's wars, their cruelties, their failures, alongside their triumphs and their sacrifices. He titled it The Unbroken Record and published it to every archive in the Coalition simultaneously. It became the most accessed document in galactic history within a week. Dren Hask accepted a position he had not expected to want. He became the first official liaison between Coalition military forces and the human fleet. He had fought beside them. He had seen their contradictions up close, the gentleness and the savagery, the songs and the blood. He did not fully understand them. He suspected he never would. But he respected them in a way that went beyond anything he had felt for his own commanders, and that was enough. Tors survived her wound. She found Dren on Citadel Yuvon 3 weeks after the battle and handed him a small metal token, a human tradition, she explained. A coin given to someone you trusted with your life. Dren held it in his palm and said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once, and she nodded back, and that was all either of them needed. Lyriel published her research. She had spent every waking hour since the battle studying human emotional patterns, trying to understand what she had felt on Throne and in the weeks that followed. Her paper was titled The Symphony Species, and it attempted to explain to a galaxy of single-instrument minds what it was like to be an entire orchestra. They do not feel one thing at a time, she wrote. They feel everything always simultaneously. They grieve while they celebrate. They fear while they charge. They love while they destroy. This is not a flaw. It is their architecture. It is what makes them capable of both the cruelty that frightened our ancestors and the sacrifice that saved our generation. You cannot have one without the other. The symphony does not work if you remove the dark notes. The paper spread across the coalition faster than any academic work in history. It was read by soldiers and scientists and children. It did not erase the fear entirely. Nothing would. But it replaced ignorance with understanding, and that was a beginning. Cassandra did not take a title. She did not claim territory or demand recognition. She turned down a seat on the High Conclave, saying that humans had spent enough of their history leading others and needed to practice walking beside them instead. Instead, she returned to throne. The planet hung in open space now, cracked and broken, its shell permanently open to the stars. It was no longer a tomb. Humans had begun rebuilding it, not as a weapon or a fortress, but as a home. The ancient cities were being repaired. The wild forests were being tended. The bioluminescent rivers flowed again, this time under real starlight that poured in through the gaps in the shell. Children played in the ruins. Human children and, for the first time, alien children too, Gorvathi kids and Silfari kids and Draelith kids, brought by diplomats and scientists who wanted the next generation to grow up seeing each other as neighbors rather than myths. Cassandra stood on the surface and watched them. The laughter echoed off ancient metal and mixed with the sound of wind moving through a world that was finally breathing. A coalition diplomat approached her. He was young and nervous and clearly unsure how to address a woman who had slept for 8,000 years and then won a war in a single battle. "General," he said carefully, "I have been asked to inquire, will humanity go to war again?" Cassandra watched the children. A human girl was teaching a Gorvathi boy how to throw a ball, adjusting her technique to account for his 4 arms. The boy laughed when he finally caught it. The sound carried far. "We always do," Cassandra said. "It is in our nature. We cannot cut it out any more than we can cut out our hearts." She turned to the diplomat. "But if we are lucky, and if you will have us maybe this time, we fight beside someone instead of against them." The diplomat nodded slowly and left. Cassandra remained on the surface as the stars turned overhead. Throne drifted among coalition stations, its ancient metal gleaming in the light of a new star. Human ships and alien ships flew in formation through the gaps in its shell, passing each other in patterns that were beginning to feel natural. 8,000 years of silence had ended. The galaxy was not the same. It would never be the same. But for the first time in a very long time, it was not afraid of what came next. It was curious. And somewhere deep inside the broken planet, the Heartspire's fatting systems logged one final entry before the old machine went quiet forever. "Waking protocol complete. They are home."